The first question sounded harmless, almost polite, the kind of thing asked to warm up a room before anything serious began. "Madam Speaker, or former Madam Speaker, I apologize," Senator John Kennedy said, his voice slow and unthreatening. "Can you remind us what year you first became Speaker of the House?" It didn't feel like a trap, more like a neighbor asking about a familiar memory over iced tea on a shaded porch. Kennedy leaned back slightly, glasses balanced low on his nose, waiting patiently, not pressing, not rushing. Then the silence arrived, not dramatic at first, just oddly empty. This wasn't the silence of strategy or political calculation, and it wasn't the pause of someone choosing careful words. It was the stillness of a thought that refused to surface, the way a familiar name sometimes vanishes mid-sentence. Nancy Pelosi sat at the witness table, flanked by two attorneys whose tailored suits probably cost more than most mortgages. She stared at Kennedy as if he'd asked her something unexpectedly technical, something abstract, something misplaced. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again, and the cameras stayed tight. Every major network had cut into regular programming for this hearing, sensing that something unpredictable was unfolding. The session had been billed as another ethics review, procedural, maybe tense, but ultimately familiar Washington theater. Yet the expression on Pelosi's face told a different story, one that didn't fit the usual script. Her eyes didn't show defiance or annoyance, but something closer to confusion, maybe even disorientation. Seconds passed, and the room began to feel uneasy. Finally she spoke, uncertainly, as if feeling her way through fog. "That was when we took back the House from the Republicans," she said, searching for the rest. Kennedy didn't interrupt, didn't help, didn't rescue the moment. He simply waited, letting the pause do the work. "January of 2007, he offered gently, almost kindly. Pelosi nodded, visibly relieved, as if grasping a rope thrown from shore. "Yes, of course," she said, though the confidence arrived a moment too late. Kennedy acknowledged the answer and moved on, his tone unchanged. "And the second time you served as Speaker, that would have been 2019, correct?" Another pause followed, longer this time, heavier. Her attorneys shifted in their chairs, one leaning forward slightly before Kennedy raised a hand. "I'd like her to answer from her own memory," he said, still calm. Pelosi stared down at the table, fingers resting motionless near a stack of papers. "I believe it was 2019, she finally said, uncertainty creeping into her voice again. Kennedy confirmed the date and continued, building the timeline carefully. He recited her years in leadership, the offices held, the authority exercised, the access granted. Speaker of the House twice, control over legislation, classified briefings, third in line for the presidency. "Do you remember that time well?" he asked. "Of course," Pelosi replied, quicker this time, almost reflexive. Kennedy nodded and reached for a document. "Then you'll remember the stock trades," he said, not accusatory, just matter of fact. He referenced March 15, 2020, a Sunday heavy with early pandemic fear. Markets were collapsing, cities were closing, uncertainty was everywhere. "Do you recall that day?" he asked. Pelosi hesitated before answering softly that she remembered the period. Kennedy described the purchase of pharmaceutical call options tied to vaccine development. He noted the timing, the proximity to major legislation, the public disclosures. Pelosi responded with familiar phrasing about her husband managing investments independently. Kennedy produced a signed disclosure form, projecting it for the room to see. Her signature was unmistakable, yet her face showed no recognition. "Do you remember signing this?" he asked, still measured. She explained that she signed many documents and relied on staff. Kennedy didn't argue. He simply asked again, yes or no. The room stayed silent long enough to feel uncomfortable. He moved forward, not pressing blame, but pressing clarity. From there, the questions expanded beyond finances into basic orientation. "What day was it?" he asked, without raising his voice. Pelosi glanced instinctively toward her lawyers before answering. When the answer came, it echoed what had been whispered to her moments earlier. Kennedy gently noted the assistants and let the moment hang. By then, viewers understood this wasn't just about paperwork or timing. It was about recall, consistency, and awareness under oath. Kennedy's questions stayed simple, almost elementary, which made the pauses louder. Dates, names, roles that once defined decades of public life came slowly, or not at all. The contrast between past authority and present hesitation was impossible to ignore. He referenced public interviews, played short clips, and asked her to reconcile them. Statements made days apart seemed to lean in different directions. He didn't accuse her of lying, only asked why the answers changed. Pelosi struggled to explain the differences without anchoring to specifics. The pattern, once noticed, became difficult to unsee. Kennedy then turned to deposition transcripts from recent civil proceedings. He read aloud the number of times she'd answered, "I don't recall." 76 times in 4 hours, each response recorded under oath. Again, he didn't editorialize, he simply asked if she remembered saying that. The irony of the question wasn't lost on anyone in the room. As the hearing continued, Democratic senators objected, citing fairness and decorum. Kennedy responded that competence was not a partisan concept. He framed everything as concern, not condemnation, observation rather than judgment. If someone lacks awareness, he said, the system around them matters. The implication lingered without being spoken directly. By the time Pelosi stood to leave, the room had already shifted. Cameras caught the uncertainty in her movements and the urgency of her staff. Kennedy warned of procedural consequences, still without raising his voice. Pelosi paused at the door, composed herself, and exited. The hearing dissolved into noise the moment she was gone. Clips spread faster than full context ever could. Short moments traveled farther than long explanations. Medical commentators speculated carefully, using words like concerning and worth evaluating. Political allies avoided specifics while urging compassion and privacy. Public opinion fractured along lines of trust rather than party. In the days that followed, statements were issued, leaves announced, investigations opened. Nothing was framed as final, everything as process. Questions multiplied instead of resolving. Could power persist beyond capacity? And who decides when it shouldn't? That uncertainty became the real story. John Kennedy later described the moment not as victory, but as obligation. He spoke of systems that protect power long after they stop protecting people. He avoided celebrating anything, instead returning to the simplicity of the questions asked. Memory, he said, isn't political, but leadership requires it. The rest, he suggested, was for the public to consider. In the end, no single accusation carried the weight of what happened. It was the accumulation of pauses, contradictions, and unanswered questions. A career measured in decades met a moment measured in seconds. The gavel didn't fall, but something undeniably shifted. And all of it began with a question so simple it seemed impossible to miss. What happens next in Washington is never just what happens in the room. It's what happens on the screens, in the clips, in the rewrites, in the "I heard and someone told me" that pile up like snowdrifts overnight. By the afternoon, the hearing wasn't a hearing anymore. It was a Rorschach test for whatever people already believed about Nancy Pelosi. Some viewers saw cruelty dressed up as concern. Others saw concern that everyone had been too polite to name. And the rest of the country, the exhausted middle, just stared at the same footage and asked the same tired question. How does it get this far? The networks ran the 20-second exchange on a loop because it was easy television. No charts, no jargon, no committees, no procedural boringness, just a direct question and a delayed answer. Commentators spoke in careful language, the kind that avoids definites and still manages to land like a hammer. Could be fatigue, one said. Could be stress, another offered. Could be something else entirely. Every sentence carried a disclaimer, but the tone carried a conclusion, and audiences are trained to hear tone more than words. Within hours, you could see the political class snapping into their usual defensive shapes. Republicans smiled like people who'd been handed a gift they didn't even have to wrap, while insisting it was not personal. Democrats pushed back hard, warning against armchair diagnoses and performative humiliation, and they weren't wrong to worry about that. But their defense ran into a wall created by the footage itself, because video doesn't argue, it just sits there and repeats. The more anyone tried to explain it away, the more the clip looked like the explanation was the real effort. Pelosi's office released a statement before nightfall, the kind of statement you can recognize by smell. It praised her historic leadership, thanked supporters, and insisted she remained fully engaged and focused on the work. It did not mention Senator John Kennedy by name, because mentioning him would validate him, and validation is oxygen. It did not address the specific pauses or the whispered prompts, because specifics are where statements go to die. Instead, it asked for respect, which is what politics always requests right after it has failed to earn it. And still, none of that touched the question that kept hovering over everything like a buzzing light fixture. If she truly didn't recognize her own signature in that moment, what exactly was she recognizing when she signed those forms? Was it routine, like autopilot on a flight? Or was it something else? Habit mistaken for awareness. When you've spent decades surrounded by staff who translate your life into folders and bullet points, how easy is it to keep nodding along? At what point does a system built to protect a leader become a system that quietly operates on their behalf? Kennedy, for his part, didn't celebrate afterward, at least not on camera. He gave the kind of remarks that sound folksy, but are designed to survive replay. "I'm not a doctor," he said, "but I got eyes, and so do the American people." That line was tailor-made for sharing, and sharing is the new voting. He framed it as a civic duty, which is always the safest costume for a political knife. Behind the scenes, because there is always a behind the scenes, the real scramble wasn't ideological. It was logistical, legal, and reputational, the three main languages spoken in modern Washington. If Pelosi took time away, who would cover which responsibilities? Who would speak for her? Who would sign what? If she didn't take time away, how many more moments like that would appear? And how many would be worse? And if the attention stayed on her long enough, how many other names might get dragged into the same conversation? Because here's the part nobody likes to say out loud. If this can happen to Nancy Pelosi, it can happen to anyone. Not because everyone is the same, but because the incentives are the same. Power does not come with an auto-off switch, and the people who benefit from your power don't rush to unplug it. They tell themselves they're helping you, protecting you, guarding your legacy, preserving stability. And sometimes, maybe they are. But stability for whom exactly? And at what cost? By the next morning, the hearing had become a national argument about standards, Not just ethical standards around trading, but basic standards around competence, transparency, and accountability. Americans who couldn't name 5 members of Congress suddenly had strong opinions about congressional disclosure forms. People who'd never watched a Senate hearing in their lives started using the word subpoena like it was a household item. And somewhere under all the noise was a deeper discomfort. The sense that the public is always the last one to know. The jokes came quickly, because in America, the joke always arrives before the reckoning. Late-night hosts leaned into the contrast between the purple suit, the pearls, the polished image, and the blank pause. Memes turned civic anxiety into punchlines, because laughter is cheaper than reform. Even some commentators who claimed to be sympathetic couldn't resist a little bite, a little "Washington is geriatric theater" sarcasm. It was funny until it wasn't, and then it was just sad dressed up as funny. On Capitol Hill, Democrats tried to steer the conversation back to policy, where it belonged in theory. They talked about prescription costs, child care, housing, democracy itself, anything but that clip. But the clip followed them like a shadow with its own media agent. Reporters stopped asking about legislation and started asking about wellness, which is how you know the story has jumped tracks. And the more leaders ducked the question, the more the question became the story. Republicans, meanwhile, played their own careful game. They avoided definitive claims, at least in formal statements, because definites create legal problems and moral problems. Instead, they asked questions in that pointed, rhetorical way that lets you imply without declaring. Who signed what, they said, and when, and who knew, and how could this happen under oath? They treated skepticism like a public service and made sure the cameras caught the solemn faces. But let's be honest, the country wasn't watching for paperwork. The country was watching for a human moment that felt too raw to be scripted. And that's what made it powerful, because viewers could imagine their own parents, their own grandparents, their own fear. The hearing wasn't just about Nancy Pelosi. It was about aging and denial and the terror of decline. When politics collides with mortality, it stops being abstract and starts feeling personal. In the following days, more clips surfaced. Not new events, just old footage re-seen through a new lens. An awkward pause at a fundraiser, a name mixed up in a press scrum, a repeated phrase in an interview that seemed harmless at the time and suddenly seemed loaded. People stitched these moments into montages like they were building a case, even though they weren't in a courtroom. And this is where things get tricky, because America loves a narrative more than it loves nuance. Once a story becomes "the system hid it," every stumble becomes evidence, and every denial becomes a cover-up. Once a story becomes "this is a smear," every question becomes harassment, and every concern becomes bad faith. Most viewers don't live in the gray. They pick a lane, and then they honk at anyone in the middle. Meanwhile, the actual truth, whatever it is, moves slowly, because truth is usually boring on camera. Pelosi's allies started speaking in the language of respect and history. They reminded everyone of her achievements, her toughness, her decades of work, her role in major legislation. They described her as sharp and engaged, which is exactly what people say when they're trying to convince themselves. They urged reporters to focus on real issues, which is fair, but it wasn't going to work. Because the public had already decided the real issue was the one nobody wanted to address directly. Even some critics, the ones with a little discipline, softened their tone once the health angle took center stage. It's one thing to argue about ethics and disclosure. It's another to mock an older woman on live television. So the smarter voices, on both sides, kept returning to the system, not the person. They asked why senior leadership roles have no consistent standards for capacity, no neutral process, no off-ramp that preserves dignity. And they asked the uglier question, is the absence of standards a bug, or is it the feature? Because if you create a clear rule, you create risk. Today, the rule might apply to Nancy Pelosi. Tomorrow, it might apply to someone you like. And Washington doesn't write rules that could be used against Washington. So we drift, and we improvise, and we pretend every situation is unique until it stops being manageable. That's how institutions decay, not in one scandal, but in 1,000 small avoidances. The stock trade thread kept tugging at the story like an exposed wire, not because anyone had proven anything on camera, but because the timing questions don't require a verdict to raise eyebrows. When big trades and big votes sit close together on a calendar, people notice, even if they don't understand the mechanics. When disclosure forms get signed like routine mail, people wonder who is really paying attention. And when a witness under oath can't comfortably recall basic markers of their own timeline, people start filling in blanks. That's the danger zone, the blank-filling zone, where speculation runs wild. Some people imagined a grand scheme, a coordinated machine, a whole hidden operation. Others imagined something simpler and more common, a powerful family doing what powerful families do, protected by a permissive system. Still others imagined something more tragic. A person sliding into confusion while the machine of politics kept moving. Indifferent. None of those theories can be declared as fact on a cable panel, but all of them can be hinted at with just asking questions. Kennedy understood that rhythm, and he played it like a fiddle. He didn't need to call anyone a criminal. He only needed to sound like a guy worried about his country. He didn't need to prove a conspiracy. He only needed to show inconsistency. He didn't need a conviction. He needed doubt. Because doubt is viral. And once doubt gets into the bloodstream of a story, it doesn't leave easily. As the week rolled on, reporters began hunting for the next chapter. Because stories need chapters. Would Pelosi appear again in public? Would she answer questions directly, unscripted, without staff hovering close? Would there be a medical evaluation, or a statement acknowledging anything beyond generic health language? And would anyone inside her circle admit, even gently, that they'd seen signs and chose to look away? That last question is the one that frightens everyone in a power circle. Because if the answer is yes, then it wasn't one person's moment. It was a whole ecosystem making a quiet calculation. Keep going, keep smiling, keep raising money, keep controlling outcomes. And if the answer is no, then the system is even worse. Because it means nobody has the courage to see what's in front of them. Either way, the country doesn't walk away comforted. By the second week, the mood shifted from shock to something like resignation. Americans have seen enough institutions wobble to recognize the pattern. There's a moment of outrage, a moment of denial, a moment of defensive statements, and then a negotiated exit. It's never framed as defeat. It's framed as time with family, and focus on health, and turning the page. And in the background, the lawyers and strategists work out what gets said and what never gets said. If Pelosi chose that path, it wouldn't be surprising. She spent a lifetime mastering the controlled exit, the disciplined message, the refusal to give opponents a clean win. But the footage made control harder, because control depends on credibility, and credibility was now the disputed territory. Every future appearance would be analyzed frame by frame, every pause turned into a headline, every correction treated as evidence. At some point, even the strongest political operator has to decide whether the stage is worth the cost. And that brings us back to the question that started all of this, the one that sounded like nothing. Not, did you do this? Not, are you guilty? Not, who coordinated what? Just, what year did you become speaker? Asked softly, like it didn't matter. In politics, the smallest questions are sometimes the sharpest, because they test reality before they test morality. And once reality looks shaky, everything else, every form, every vote, every defense, starts to look shakier too. After that, the story stopped being about one hearing and started being about timing, because timing is the quiet obsession of American politics. When something breaks, matters almost as much as what breaks, and this had broken at a moment when the country was already tired, suspicious, and primed to believe nothing happens by accident. People weren't just asking what Pelosi remembered, they were asking why this conversation hadn't happened years earlier. If the warning signs were real, why did they surface now, after elections, after leadership transitions, after power had already shifted? That question didn't accuse anyone outright, but it sat there like an unanswered voicemail everyone pretended not to hear. Inside Washington, aides and former staffers spoke anonymously in the careful way that signals both loyalty and distance. They used phrases like long days, unrelenting pressure, and the toll of leadership, which are true and also wonderfully non-committal. Some described a woman still sharp in private meetings, but slower in public settings, as if the camera itself added weight. Others insisted they'd noticed nothing unusual at all, which raised its own questions about what unusual even means in that environment. When power becomes routine, even deterioration can start to look normal. There was also the quieter discomfort that no one wanted to articulate directly because it sounds cruel if said the wrong way. Age doesn't disqualify anyone from public service, but pretending age has no consequences disqualifies reality itself. The system relies on self-awareness, yet rewards those who never admit limits. In that tension, people tend to keep going until they physically can't, because stopping feels like surrender. And surrender, in Washington, is treated as a personal failure rather than a structural necessity. As the days passed, the questions around disclosure forms and signatures took on a different tone. Not why did this happen, but how often does this happen without anyone noticing? Congress runs on paper, on initials, on approvals that come fast and stack up faster. When a senior figure signs something, the assumption is that review has already happened somewhere upstream. But assumptions are not safeguards, and the hearing cracked that illusion just enough to make people uneasy. Some commentators tried to redirect the story toward broader reform, sensing an opportunity in the discomfort. They talked about blind trusts, stricter trading windows, clearer reporting timelines, all the familiar wish list items. Those conversations had existed before, of course, but they'd never quite caught fire. Now they had a human face, and that changed the temperature. It's easier to ignore a spreadsheet than a moment of visible confusion. Still, reform talk always runs into the same wall. No one wants to legislate against their own future. Every rule imagined today you might apply to someone powerful tomorrow, maybe even the person proposing it. So proposals get studied, committees get formed, white papers get written. Momentum slows, then stalls, then quietly disappears. The hearing didn't break that pattern, but it made the pattern harder to deny. Pelosi herself remained mostly silent in the aftermath, which only deepened the sense of unfinished business. Silence can read as dignity, or avoidance, or exhaustion, depending on who's watching. In politics, silence is rarely neutral, but it's often strategic. Each day without a public appearance allowed the story to cool slightly, but never fully. Absence created space, and space invites interpretation. Meanwhile, Senator Kennedy's profile rose, not because he declared victory, but because he didn't. He avoided cable news saturation, choosing instead a handful of controlled appearances. He spoke in generalities about responsibility, transparency, and the need to ask uncomfortable questions. By not pushing the knife further, he made the original cut look cleaner. Sometimes restraint amplifies impact more than repetition ever could. The broader public reaction settled into something quieter, but more lasting than outrage. Polls showed uncertainty hardening into skepticism, not just about Pelosi, but about congressional leadership as a whole. Trust, once dented, doesn't bounce back quickly, especially when the explanation feels incomplete. People didn't need a villain. They needed assurance the system wasn't sleepwalking. What they got instead was a reminder that systems are only as alert as the people running them. In conversations far from Washington, the hearing became a shorthand for a larger anxiety. Families talked about aging parents and difficult conversations that never seemed to come early enough. Workers talked about colleagues who stayed too long because no one wanted to offend them. The political story bled into a cultural one about denial and delay. That resonance is what kept the story alive after the news cycle moved on. Eventually, attention drifted, as it always does, toward the next controversy waiting its turn. But the clip didn't disappear. It lingered in the background, resurfacing whenever leadership and competence came up. It became a reference point, a quiet "remember that," tucked into future debates. Not a verdict, not a smoking gun, just a shared memory of discomfort. And sometimes, in politics, shared discomfort is more powerful than shared certainty. What remained unresolved wasn't whether Nancy Pelosi had done something wrong, but whether the system had done enough right. Had it protected the public interest? Or had it protected itself? Had it asked hard questions early, or waited until the answers were painful to watch? Those aren't questions with neat conclusions, which is why they matter. They stay open, hovering, long after the gavel falls and the cameras move on.